before we did the derivative of trig functions, this is the derivative of inverse trig functions. This does not mean that it's to the -1 power, okay? This is the inverse sine, this is the inverse cosine, inverse tangent, and inverse of those, okay? When you see it on the AP test, sometimes it's written as the inverse sine of x. That's the same as the arc sine. So if you see arc sine and you're like, what does that mean? It's the same as the inverse sine, okay? So these are the same as each other. So arc sine of x would be the same as inverse sine of x. So if you see that, I don't know if it comes up in the homework, but it definitely comes up on the AP test where they'll write arc instead of inverse. It's the same thing. The two big ones here that you have to memorize that'll come up on the AP test every single year are inverse sine, so this one, and the inverse tangent. The other ones do not come up on the AP test. The other ones will come up in your homework, so you'll have to be able to use them. Using them is pretty much the same for all of them. If you can use one of them, you can use all of them, so that part's not difficult, but make sure you have this one memorized and this one memorized. Inverse tangent does not have a square root. Inverse sine does have a square root. That's something that you should definitely recognize. Later on, like second semester, we'll be working backwards, so they'll give you something like this, or they'll give you something like this, and you have to know if it's inverse sine or inverse tangent. So recognizing this has a square root is huge, okay, and that this one doesn't. And then this one obviously is subtracting, and this one's adding. So let's actually try to do the derivative. So if I'm doing the derivative of this, you can either use the quotient rule, or what can I do with it? If you have 1 over something, you can move it up to the numerator, right? So there's two ways to do this one. If you move this to the numerator, it doesn't change this sign, okay? It's going to just change it into the inverse sine of x to the negative first power. Right now it's like this inverse sine of x to the first power. So when you move it up, it brings it to the negative first power. Okay, this is not an exponent. Does everyone understand that? Okay, so if we do it this way, taking the derivative, what's our outside function of this that we have to do first? This -1 exponent, right? So what do I do with that -1 exponent? Bring it down front, and then I leave the inverse sign alone, and it's going to be raised to the -2. And then you multiply by the derivative of the inside. And the derivative of inverse sine is this, so you would just write this in the back there. So questions on that at all? And then I suppose we could rewrite it how they would write it on the AP test. So the -1 would probably go in the numerator. The square root is definitely in the denominator. And then how would I write this? So it's the inverse sine of x to the what power? Second, if I move it down. And then you still have that square root of 1 minus x squared. Questions on that? Okay, back here, what do you think you're going to have to use? Product rule. Okay, so that's what we're going to have to use here as a product rule. So you still have all those other rules still applying. Okay, and inverse tangent, I just want it showing there. So I will leave the x alone, and this is the harder part of it. So leave the x alone, and we're going to take the derivative of inverse tangent of square root of x. So notice here that instead of x, we're doing a square root of x, right? So when we're up in this problem here, instead of the x, what am I going to put into that x's spot? Square root of x. So when I take the derivative of inverse tangent of this, it turns into 1 over 1 plus that squared. So we have 1 over 1 plus, and then square root of x goes in that spot, squared. How could I write that instead of how I've written it? 1 over 1 plus x. Okay, I'm just writing it like this for your notes so you can see why it's not squared. Okay, then this is the inside function, isn't it? So what do we have to do with that? So we left the x alone, and we're taking the derivative of this. So we took the derivative of the inverse tangent part. We left the inside alone, and then we multiply by the derivative of this. So this is x to the half. The derivative would be 1/2 x to the negative half. Am I done? No, I've only done the first half, right? I left this alone, took the derivative of that, plus, what's the derivative of x? 1, and then you leave the other part alone. Now it's gone again. Nope. So then in the back here, you should have written plus, whoops, get this going again. So derivative of x is 1, and then you just have the inverse tangent of square root of x, so just written the way it is. Then if we try to clean this up, this isn't going to change at all, but this piece here, we just try to figure out what would go in the numerator, what would go in the denominator. So what would be in the numerator for all of this stuff? This x here. So I would put the x in the numerator. So that piece is taken care of. And then I would have a 2 in the denominator because of the half. This would turn into what in the denominator? Square root of x. And then this stuff here is all one term, so I'll put parentheses around it, and that's going to turn into 1 plus x. And now these two pieces here will reduce. So if you didn't do that, let's do that next. What is x over square root of x the same as? Just square root of x in the numerator. Remember, you subtract your exponents. So this is x to the first, this is x to the half. So if you subtract those exponents, you get x to the half up here. And then we just have the 2 times 1 plus x. And then plus the inverse tangent of square root of x. So questions on that at all? Your homework will be, really similar to that. So again, the only two that you have to memorize are these two here. Okay, the other ones you're going to have to use, but feel free to use your notes for those. These ones, you might as well memorize them now because you're going to have to get them memorized at some point. So, questions on that? Okay. Okay, so here's your homework assignment. Go ahead and get to work.